David Langston stepped off the plane at Suvarnabhumi Airport with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a head full of anticipation. For years, he had dreamed of a trip that would break him out of routine and reconnect him with something deeper, something primal and unexplainable. A recent string of personal losses, including the death of his father and the end of a 10-year relationship, had left him unmoored. Thailand, with its spiritual landscapes, lush jungles and storied temples, seemed like the right place to get lost, and maybe, just maybe, to be found again. After checking into a modest guesthouse near the Chao Phraya River, David wandered through the buzzing streets of Bangkok, feeling both out of place and curiously at ease. That night, while sipping a Chang beer at a street vendor's stall, he met a man who would change everything. The man was in his late 40s, gaunt but muscular, with eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He introduced himself simply as Kai. Kai asked David what he was seeking, not in a casual way, but as if he already knew the answer. David, slightly buzzed, replied without pretense. Peace, purpose, something real. Kai nodded slowly and said he knew of a place that wasn't in any guidebook. A location deep in the forests of northern Thailand where monks still practiced an ancient form of sensory deprivation, a rite meant to cleanse the mind by confronting the ego. David was intrigued, but Kai offered no map, no details, just an invitation to meet him at dawn the next day by the edge of the Ping River, near a weathered teak bridge. There was something oddly persuasive in his tone, and David, swayed by a mix of curiosity and desperation, agreed. That night, lying in bed beneath the hum of a ceiling fan, David's mind spun with possibilities. Who was Kai really? A scammer? A mystic? A madman? Yet something about the man's presence lingered in his bones like an itch he couldn't reach. Before sunrise, David packed a small day bag, water, a flashlight, a journal, and a pocket knife, and left a note on his phone meant for a close friend in New York, going off-grid for a few days. Don't worry unless you don't hear from me by Sunday. He hit send, unaware that this message would become the only breadcrumb in a trail that would soon go cold. He arrived at the bridge just as the fog rolled in from the river, painting the morning in a thick, ghostly white. Kai was already waiting, leaning against a rusted motorbike. Without saying a word, he handed David a helmet and started the engine. The ride north was long and hypnotic, taking them from paved highways to cracked backroads and, eventually, onto dirt trails swallowed by jungle. With each mile, the noise of civilization dimmed, and an eerie silence took its place. Birds chirped, trees swayed, but the farther they went, the less David could tell what direction they were heading. After hours of riding, Kai pulled over near a clearing that was marked by a stone pillar covered in lichen and symbols David couldn't decipher. Kai finally spoke again. From here we walk. Leave the bike. Leave anything unnecessary. David hesitated but complied, leaving behind everything except his journal and water. They hiked for hours through terrain that grew increasingly remote. No signs, no paths, only Kai's word that they were going the right way. Along the way, Kai remained cryptic, speaking only in fragments about the forest being alive and watching. Occasionally, he'd pause to touch a tree or whisper into the foliage, actions that unnerved David more than he cared to admit. As night approached, they arrived at a small bamboo hut beside a slow-moving stream. Inside, it was empty save for a mat, a bowl, and a single unlit candle. You'll sleep here, Kai said, lighting the candle and placing it near the wall. Tomorrow, the trial begins. David asked what kind of trial, but Kai only smiled and exited into the darkness, his footsteps fading like a ghost. David sat cross-legged on the mat, unease spreading through him like ink in water. The air felt heavy, not just with humidity but with expectation, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He opened his journal to write, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stared at the candlelight flickering on the bamboo walls, wondering if he'd just stepped into a ritual or a trap. Despite the surreal atmosphere, exhaustion took him quickly, and he fell into a dreamless sleep. When he woke the next morning, Kai was gone. In his place, carved into the dirt just outside the hut, were symbols, spirals, eyes and hands, all pointing toward a path that led deeper into the jungle. With no other choice and no way to contact the outside world, David followed the path. It would be the last time he moved freely for days. The deeper David ventured down the narrow, root-choked trail, the more the jungle seemed to close in around him, swallowing the path behind him like a mouth sealing shut. Every footstep felt heavier, not from fatigue but from the weight of isolation that now pressed down on his shoulders. The vibrant greens, once beautiful, now seemed oppressive, and the sounds of the forest, chirps, clicks, rustles, shifted from exotic to menacing. Though Kai had always been a few steps ahead during the previous day's journey, today there was no sign of him at all. It was as if Kai had dissolved into the forest, leaving only those crude symbols in the soil as his farewell. David pressed forward, increasingly uncertain whether he was walking into enlightenment or something far darker. He carried no phone signal, no compass, no clear understanding of where he was, and the sun, blotted out by the thick canopy, was of little help. Hours passed with no sign of human life. Then, just as panic began to crawl up the back of his throat, he saw it. A small wooden post with a strip of red cloth tied to it, fluttering like a warning in the still air. Next to it was a weathered notebook nailed to a tree, its pages stiff with moisture. Scribbled across the open page was a single line. "The path reveals the seeker." David paused, his pulse quickening. He looked around, expecting to see someone, or something, watching him, but nothing stirred. He considered turning back, but he couldn't even remember the last landmark, and the trail behind him had all but disappeared beneath the forest floor. Pressing onward, he found the jungle transforming. The sounds grew quieter. The air thickened. Strange stone statues emerged along the path. Headless figures, disfigured animals, twisted bodies frozen in anguish, partially buried in moss and mud. Each seemed to leer at him, their meaning unclear but undeniably ominous. As twilight approached, he found himself entering what appeared to be an ancient ruin. A clearing surrounded by crumbling stone pillars and an altar etched with symbols similar to those near the hut. At the center was a blackened stone basin filled with water so still it reflected the sky like glass. Feeling inexplicably drawn to it, David knelt beside the basin and looked into its reflection. For a moment he thought he saw another face, one not his own, gazing back. He stumbled away, breath ragged, heart pounding. That night, he slept under the ruins, too afraid to move deeper, too lost to return. The next morning brought a sense of disorientation more profound than simple grogginess. The forest felt rearranged. Trails he thought he recognized were gone, replaced by corridors of vines and tangled branches. He began shouting for Kai, then for anyone, but his voice was swallowed by the trees. His canteen was nearly empty, and his legs ached from uneven terrain. He took out his journal, scrawling what he could remember. Dates, sensations, names of plants he'd seen, a sketch of the basin. Something about writing grounded him. By midday, he stumbled across another marker. This time, a simple cloth satchel hanging from a tree branch. Inside was a folded note. "The ego must be shed like old skin." There was no signature, just that sentence as cryptic as ever. The next few hours passed in a blur of thorns, sweat, and creeping dread. He began to hear whispers, not in his ears, but in his mind, as if the forest were speaking in riddles. They weren't words exactly, more like impressions. Follow the loss, lie down, bury the self. He tried to fight the thoughts, but the more he resisted, the louder they became. Around late afternoon, he reached a steep incline, and beyond it, a shallow cave. The entrance was shrouded in vines and gave off an earthy, mineral scent. Though everything in him screamed not to go in, his feet moved on their own. Inside the cave, the temperature dropped dramatically. The walls were lined with more of those haunting symbols, and in the center was a wooden box, ornate, waist-high, with iron clasps but no lock. As he approached, he noticed faint footprints in the dirt leading both to and from the box. That was the last thing he remembered clearly. A sudden sharp smell, like burning herbs and copper, hit his nose. Then blackness. When he opened his eyes, it was night, and he was lying outside the cave with his arms and legs loosely bound in coarse rope. His journal was gone. His canteen was crushed beside him. His mouth was gagged, and there was blood in his hair. Panic rose as he tried to scream but only managed a muffled cry. He rolled to his side and realized that someone, perhaps multiple people, had carried him here and left him in a way that implied ritual, not violence. But the intent was unclear and the terror absolute. As he writhed against the bindings, he spotted a faint light bobbing in the trees, like a lantern or firefly, and then it vanished. He blacked out again. Whether from fear, injury, or some unseen chemical agent, he couldn't tell. The next thing he knew, he was inside something small and suffocating. A space with no light and barely enough room to move. Dirt filtered through gaps in the wood. And for the first time it hit him, he wasn't lost. He had been hidden, buried, on purpose. David awoke to an all-consuming darkness, the kind that robs a person of any sense of time or space. The air was stale and hot, pressing in on him like a second skin. His limbs were cramped, barely able to twitch, and his chest felt like it had been wrapped in barbed wire. At first, he thought he might still be dreaming, trapped in some feverish hallucination brought on by exhaustion or dehydration. But then the cold reality struck. He couldn't move more than a few inches in any direction. Wood scraped his skin with each shallow breath, and dirt trickled down through thin gaps above his face. He was inside a box, a wooden box, and worse, he was underground. The crushing silence was interrupted only by the thundering of his heart and the ragged, panicked sound of his own breath. He tried to scream, but his throat was raw and dry, and the enclosed space turned his voice into a muted gasp. For several minutes or hours, he simply froze, too afraid to move, too stunned to even think. Then the realization began to claw its way in. He had been buried alive. He fought to steady his breathing, remembering every horror story he had ever heard about premature burials. The stories were always ancient, distant, but this was real. He felt around, managing only to confirm the worst. For solid wooden walls, a ceiling just inches from his nose, and a dirt floor beneath him. There was no food, no water, no tools. Just him, trapped in what felt like a coffin designed by someone who knew exactly how to make fear permanent. His fingers trembled as they traced the walls for any weakness, any cracks or hinges, but found nothing. Whoever had placed him here didn't want him to escape. Yet the box wasn't fully airtight. He could feel the faintest currents of air leaking in from somewhere. Enough to stay alive. But for how long? Seconds dragged into minutes, minutes into what felt like hours. The darkness played tricks on his mind. He heard voices whispering, sometimes calling his name, sometimes just murmuring unintelligible phrases in a language he didn't understand. He screamed back at them until his voice gave out, until there was only silence again, deeper than before. Meanwhile, far from the jungle, the real world was stirring. David's friend Jessica in New York had received the message, "Don't worry unless you don't hear from me by Sunday." It was Monday. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Delays, a broken phone, a missed connection. But by Tuesday, dread had fully set in. She contacted the local embassy in Bangkok and filed a missing persons report. Thai authorities began to investigate, but the lack of a specific location or itinerary made the search feel futile. All they had was a digital breadcrumb, a time-stamped message sent 3 days ago. It would take time for the embassy to escalate the search. Meanwhile, local police asked around in guesthouses and hostels, showing David's photo, but no one had seen him since he left that morning. Word spread slowly across the city, then onto expat forums, then into the inbox of a travel blogger who recalled meeting a man named Kai years ago. A mysterious figure who led tourists on so-called spiritual journeys into the jungle and was later linked to a series of unexplained disappearances. Back in the box, David's sense of time fractured. Hunger gnawed at him with increasing fury, but it was the thirst that truly unraveled him. His tongue swelled, his lips cracked, and each breath scraped his throat like sandpaper. The heat built in waves, and with it came visions, whether dreams or hallucinations he couldn't say. He saw flashes of people's faces. His mother, his ex-girlfriend, Kai's haunting stare. He saw fireflies forming words in midair, spelling out riddles in smoke. At times, he felt weightless, floating above the jungle, watching himself from a distance as if he were already dead. Other times, he felt the pressure of unseen hands pressing down on the box, as if someone or something was standing above him. Every creak in the woods sounded like an earthquake, every thump like the world closing in. And then, on the second night, or was it the third? He heard it. A distinct noise, rhythmic and soft. A drum, or perhaps a chant. It came from above, somewhere through the layers of soil. He couldn't be sure if it was real or just the echo of madness, but it filled him with a terrible hope. He clawed at the wood with his fingernails until they bled, slamming his fists until the pain forced him into stillness. At one point, he began to recite the names of every person he loved, trying to tether himself to the world above. He prayed, though he didn't believe in anything specific. He cursed Kai's name, then pleaded with him as if the man could hear. At some point he passed out or slept, or slipped into a state beyond exhaustion. When he awoke again, the box was trembling slightly, and dirt rained down from above. He thought it was the end, that the earth would collapse and consume him fully. But then a voice, distant but unmistakable, human, calling out in Thai. Then another, closer, the sound of digging, wood splintered. A shaft of golden light broke through the top of the box, nearly blinding him. A hand reached in, rough and calloused, and pulled him toward the surface. He emerged like a man reborn, gasping, filthy, skeletal. The light seared his eyes. All around him stood a group of orange-robed monks, silent and solemn, as if they had just pulled him from the underworld. One of them held a carved wooden staff topped with a symbol that David recognized from the hut, from the cave, from the box. Before he could speak, his legs gave out, and he collapsed into their arms. Somewhere in the background, a bell rang, slow and steady, as the monks lifted him and carried him away. Inside that coffin of wood and dirt, time fractured like shattered glass, splintering into moments that bled into each other without rhythm or reason. David no longer knew whether he had been trapped for hours, days, or mere minutes, only that every second stretched like an eternity across the raw edges of his nerves. In the initial throes of panic, he had fought violently against the walls, scraping his knuckles raw, slamming his heels until the reverberations made his bones ache. But the box had remained firm and unmoved, a prison designed for silence and suffering. The darkness became a second skin, suffocating, tactile, pressing against his eyelids even when he closed them, as though his body were being swallowed by shadows. Deprived of light, his senses turned inward, and the real torture began. Not physical but mental, a slow unthreading of identity that unraveled him one memory at a time. He could still recall the scent of the river in Bangkok, the look on Kai's face, the soft fizz of the beer bottle he'd opened on that first night. But those details began to feel like someone else's life, scenes from a movie he had once watched long ago. The first hallucinations came as whispers, faint at first, then persistent, curling through the silence like smoke. His name was said in voices he both recognized and didn't. Sometimes his mother's gentle call, sometimes the cold, clinical tone of a stranger. He would jerk his head toward the sound only to remember that there was no direction in this darkness, no space beyond the claustrophobic dimensions of the box. Then came the lights, small, flickering specks of white and blue that danced behind his closed eyelids, forming patterns he could almost decipher. They became faces, symbols, entire landscapes. A jungle path glowing with bioluminescent vines. A circle of masked figures chanting around a pit of fire. Kai standing above him, whispering something in a language not of this world. At one point, he became convinced that he was no longer buried at all but floating in space, suspended in a vacuum where the only thing anchoring him to life was pain. When he screamed, it wasn't to be saved. It was to remember he still existed. As the hours or days dragged on, reality eroded into fragments. He began to bargain, offering everything. His money, his memories, even his soul, to anything listening in the void. He recited the names of loved ones until the syllables lost meaning. He told himself stories, real or imagined, just to pass the silence. He relived old regrets with painful clarity. The moment he didn't visit his father in the hospital, the phone call he ignored from his ex when she needed him, the promises he never fulfilled. The box became a confessional, a crucible, a judge. He questioned his own sanity, debated aloud whether this was a punishment, a trial, or death itself. Was this Kai's initiation? A spiritual test to shatter the ego? Or was it simply cruelty? At one point, he began to speak directly to the box, naming it, pleading with it, cursing it. He called it the Hollow, a name that seemed to take on a life of its own. He wept without tears, dry sobs that rattled his chest and left him more exhausted than before. There were moments of utter stillness when he became convinced that if he just stayed perfectly still, he would disappear, dissolve into the wood and earth like compost. Then there were moments of blinding rage, where he battered the box walls with everything he had left, cracking his fingernails, bruising his bones, screaming until his throat was bloodied. Sleep, when it came, was not relief but a nightmare spiral. In dreams, he fell endlessly through darkness, then awoke to the same. He began to wonder if he was already dead and simply refusing to accept it. His mind conjured companions, an old friend who spoke in riddles, a girl from his childhood who sang lullabies through the floorboards. He had entire conversations with them, argued with them, even laughed once, only to snap back into the nightmare of truth. By what he guessed to be the second day, his body began to give up. His muscles trembled with every shift, and his skin burned from dehydration. He stopped sweating and knew that was a bad sign. The dryness in his mouth was now a constant scraping pain, and his lips were splitting open. He licked the dampness of the coffin walls, hoping for a single drop of moisture. He tasted mold, wood, and dust. The hallucinations grew more elaborate. He imagined crawling out of the coffin into a new world where people wore blindfolds and bowed to a flame. He saw himself being led through a tunnel by Kai, who whispered, "You are ready." Ready for what? To die? To be reborn? He didn't know. The line between life and dream had become so blurred that he could no longer separate suffering from surrender. And then, in the thickest part of the ordeal, something shifted. He heard chanting. Not the imagined kind, but rhythmic, real, vibrating through the ground. He held his breath, not out of hope, but because he was afraid to wake himself from what might be another illusion. But the sound persisted, growing louder. The earth above him stirred. He felt pressure, weight shifting, footsteps, and then, without warning, the box creaked. His heart surged. Then a crack split through the darkness, a ray of blinding light stabbing his eyes. Dirt poured in, a hand reached down, and the outside world rushed back in with all the force of a hurricane. And yet, as he was lifted out into the golden haze of daylight, a part of him remained in the box. A part of him had been buried, and it would never be fully dug up again. When the monks pulled David from the soil, it was as though the jungle itself exhaled. The forest, once oppressive and watching, now seemed strangely calm, as if it had finished with him. The sunlight was brutal against his eyes, which hadn't seen light in what felt like lifetimes, and his body shook under its warmth. Dirt clung to every inch of his skin, and blood crusted around the edges of his mouth, ears, and fingers. His lips were cracked beyond recognition, and his throat could barely produce sound. The monks didn't speak. They simply worked in quiet unison, cleansing his body with cool water, wrapping him in clean fabric, and placing herbs on the wounds he didn't realize he had. Their faces were unreadable, serene in the face of what should have been chaos. It wasn't until David saw his own reflection in a basin that he realized how unrecognizable he had become. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, a look of someone who had come face to face with something beyond comprehension. And yet none of them asked him questions. They behaved as if they had been expecting him, as though his emergence from the earth had been part of some divine timetable only they understood. The journey away from the burial site was quiet and slow. Carried on a makeshift stretcher through dense undergrowth, David passed places he didn't recognize, though a faint part of him wondered if he had seen them before through fevered hallucinations. At one point, he thought he spotted the stone basin again, but now it was dry, cracked, and lifeless, like a memory turned to dust. The monks brought him to a secluded monastery deep in the hills, built into the slope of a mountain, hidden from the world by both nature and intention. No tourists ventured here. No locals even mentioned it by name. It existed in silence, and within its walls, David was given refuge. Days passed, maybe more. He could not track time. The monks fed him, washed his wounds, sat with him during the long stretches where he said nothing. He still struggled to eat or speak, but his eyes absorbed everything. The quiet rituals, the patterns of prayer, the endless hum of chants that echoed through the halls at sunrise and dusk. Slowly, a fragile sense of self began to stitch back together, thread by thread. When he finally found his voice, the first words he managed to whisper were, "Why did you find me?" A younger monk responded in calm English. "We didn't. We were guided." David wanted to ask what that meant, but the monk only smiled and handed him a cup of warm tea laced with something that made his limbs go heavy and his mind slide into calm. Later, another monk, a man with silver hair and eyes that had clearly seen suffering, came to his side. In a deep voice, he said, "Some trials are not punishments. They are passages." David didn't respond. He couldn't. But the words planted themselves somewhere deep inside him, deeper than language, where meaning rests without sound. Eventually, David asked about Kai. He described the man, his voice still hoarse, and the monks exchanged glances but said nothing. When he pressed, one finally replied, "That name hasn't been spoken here in many years." It sent a chill through him. Had Kai been one of them once? Had he gone rogue? Or was he something else entirely, neither part of this world nor apart from it? A week later, after regaining some strength, David was escorted by two monks to a nearby town where authorities had already been notified. To his surprise, they had been expecting him. Somehow, someone from the monastery had made contact. A doctor examined him, and the official report listed him as a lost tourist recovered from dehydration and exposure. No mention of a coffin. No note of burial. When he tried to explain what had happened, the language barrier between him and the local police quickly became a wall. They nodded politely, made notes, and filed paperwork, but none of it captured the truth. And the truth, he began to realize, wasn't something they wanted to write down. He contacted Jessica back in New York, and when her voice broke through the phone, sobbing and laughing at once, it felt like hearing from another lifetime. She asked what happened, and he found himself unable to say the words. What could he tell her? That he was buried alive in the jungle by a man who may or may not exist. That monks saved him after being guided by dreams or visions. It all sounded like madness. Still, arrangements were made, and within 3 days he was on a flight back to the United States. The airplane cabin felt surreal, too sterile, too clean. Every time the overhead bin clicked shut or the landing gear shifted, he flinched. The claustrophobia hadn't left. He still found himself checking corners for walls that might close in, ceilings that might lower without warning. He avoided the bathroom entirely, unwilling to be locked inside anything again. Flight attendants looked at him with puzzled concern, but he brushed it off. "Just jet lag," he mumbled. When the plane touched down in New York, the city's cold wind slapped his face like a baptism, sharp and real. Jessica was waiting at the terminal, eyes wide, arms trembling as she embraced him. He didn't return the hug right away. He just stood there, overwhelmed by the crush of fluorescent lights and announcements blaring from loudspeakers. Everything felt too loud, too fast, too artificial. In the days that followed, his story made headlines. American tourist found after mysterious disappearance in Thailand? Buried alive? Survivor tells shocking tale. Spiritual retreat gone wrong. News crews surrounded his apartment building, and interview requests poured in from every direction. David gave one statement, brief and carefully worded. He confirmed he had been lost, said he was grateful to be alive, and declined to comment further. But online, the narrative took on a life of its own. Forums filled with theories. Some claimed he had been part of an ancient initiation. Others believed he'd stumbled into an illegal cult. A few dismissed it all as delusion brought on by hallucinogens or a head injury. David didn't care. Let them believe what they wanted. He knew what had happened, even if the words still failed him. At night, when the noise died down and he was finally alone, he would sit in his darkened apartment and place his ear to the wooden floor, listening for the silence that once surrounded him. And sometimes, in the stillness, he swore he could hear it, the faint whisper of dirt being shoveled overhead, as though the hollow was still calling. Back in New York, David found himself in a world that no longer fit the shape of his thoughts. The city buzzed with the urgency of routine. Horns blaring, subways rushing, people glued to phones. Yet none of it felt real. The rhythm of life had continued without him, but he moved through it like a ghost, unsure of where his old self ended and the new one began. Despite returning to his apartment, his belongings, and the life he had once known, David no longer felt at home in any of it. The bed was too soft. The lights were too bright. The walls, though far apart, still carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The moment he shut the bathroom door, a cold sweat would break across his back, and the thought of elevators or subway cars sent his pulse racing. But it wasn't just fear that haunted him, it was doubt. Had it really happened the way he remembered? Had he truly been buried? Or had he stumbled into some hallucinatory state brought on by plants, rituals, or trauma? He tried to journal it all, but the words felt incomplete, too fragile to capture the weight of what he'd endured. The world, however, didn't give him time to retreat. Once word got out, reporters circled like vultures. He declined every major interview, but that didn't stop the stories. Mystical cult in Thai jungle, one tabloid declared. Buried and reborn, read another. Conspiracy theorists had a field day. Podcasts dissected his story for hours, arguing over inconsistencies, analyzing satellite imagery, and pulling quotes from obscure online forums. A few spiritual bloggers hailed him as a chosen one, a survivor of an ancient rite meant to strip away ego and prepare the soul for awakening. Some even claimed to have dreamed of him before the news broke, reporting visions of a man clawing his way out of the earth. Theories ranged from ritual sacrifice to alien abduction to deep-state experimentation. David stopped reading them after a while, but he couldn't help noticing that even the most bizarre theories still circled around one undeniable fact. No one knew why it happened, and no one could explain how he survived. Despite his desire to disappear, the world kept pulling him back into the spotlight. A small publisher offered him a book deal, but he turned it down. A documentary crew flew in from Europe, promising a sensitive retelling of his experience. He refused that, too. He didn't want his trauma to be repackaged for profit or entertainment. Still, people recognized him. On the street, in cafes, at the grocery store, strangers would stop him, tilt their heads, and ask if he was that guy. He learned to nod without engaging, to escape conversations before they turned invasive. Even the people closest to him began to pull away. Jessica, once so full of concern and empathy, now looked at him like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Their conversations grew shorter, more awkward. She wanted to understand, but he could feel her growing frustrated with his silence. Eventually, she stopped calling altogether. Friends drifted, unsure of how to treat someone who had walked through hell and returned with no answers. At night, sleep eluded him. Even in the safety of his own bed, David would jolt awake, gasping for breath, convinced he was still inside the box. He would crawl to the floor, press his ear to the hardwood, and listen. Sometimes it was silent. Other times, he swore he could hear movement. Scratches, distant chanting, the thump of soil. He began to sketch the symbols he remembered from the jungle. The spirals, the eyes, the clawed hands, and soon his walls were covered in them. They brought no peace, but he couldn't stop drawing. One morning, he woke to find a new symbol drawn on his arm in ash, one he didn't remember making. Another time, he found a small mound of dirt on his pillow, though his windows had been shut and the apartment sealed. He began to wonder if something had followed him back, not physically, but through the veil his mind had once torn open. Was it madness? Or was the jungle not done with him? Eventually, a professor of comparative religion reached out after reading an obscure blog post about David's ordeal. She claimed to recognize the symbols he described, linking them to a forgotten sect of forest ascetics in northern Thailand, a group rumored to use underground confinement as a rite of ego death. Most scholars dismissed it as myth, but the professor insisted she had seen similar patterns carved into stone deep within temple ruins no longer open to the public. She asked if he'd be willing to meet. Against his better judgment, David agreed. The meeting was brief but unsettling. She brought with her a parchment containing etchings of the same symbols that had haunted his dreams. When he confirmed their similarity, she grew pale. "These rites were believed to call something forth," she said, folding the paper slowly. "Not gods, exactly, but intelligences, something older than language, something buried long before we were born." David asked what they wanted. She replied, "To be remembered." That night, David dreamed of the hollow again, this time from above. He saw other boxes, dozens, hundreds, some full, some still waiting. In the weeks that followed, he tried to move on. He changed apartments, grew a beard, traveled upstate. But the feeling never left him. That sense that his ordeal hadn't ended. It had begun. The jungle was no longer a place to him. It was a presence. He saw it in alley shadows, in subway tunnels, in the way strangers lingered too long in his peripheral vision. On one particularly cold morning, he returned home to find a single red cloth tied to the knob of his front door. No note, no explanation, just a silent invitation or a warning. He untied it and placed it in a box at the back of his closet. But some nights, when the wind howled just right, he could swear it fluttered. And so, David lived on, never truly escaping, never fully belonging. Not dead, but not quite among the living either. He had returned from the jungle with breath in his lungs and a story in his mind. But something essential had been left behind, buried in the earth beneath ancient trees. Whether it was his innocence, his sanity, or his soul, he wasn't sure. All he knew was this: not every traveler comes home. Some return carrying echoes, others carrying warnings. And a few, like him, come back carrying something they were never meant to find.